Hello, everyone. This is Managing Emotion. We're in week 3 of our 4-week coaching program. I'm Susan Shahada. I'm here once again with Colleen Buckman. And Colleen is going to take us into some mindfulness to start us off again today.
Hello, everyone. So let's just check in with how you're doing right now. So you can just close your eyes if you can, where you are, and bring your awareness down into the center of your being. So you're going to gently move out of your mind, more into your chest, your belly, your heart, around the heart and the lungs, that area. And just check in with how you're doing right this second. Any feelings that are happening, whatever is going on. And in this place, we're going to take one nice, big, deep breath in and out. And then we're going to do those 20 connected breaths that we did last week. So I will count for you. So you just want to take one short breath in through the nose and out through the nose. Good. We're going to do 4 of those and then one long breath. And we're going to do that 4 times. So it's just. Good. And just a few cleansers. And one more big deep breath. Good. And with that, I will pass it back to Susan.
All right. Thank you, Colleen. So today we are going to be talking about emotional regulation and what it is and how to begin to be more mindful in relationship to how you regulate your emotions. And then we are also going to be diving into anger, another one of our primary human emotions. So let us begin with what is emotional regulation. Now, emotional regulation is just sort of how it sounds like, is essentially our ability to manage and respond effectively to experiences that create big or overwhelming feelings. So this is sometimes called self-regulation as well. And it's a skill that we don't necessarily consciously think about. It's something that is often we're just doing unconsciously based on strategies that we've gleaned over time. And these strategies, we've picked them up based on any number of things, most likely, just like all of our emotions and our way we process emotions, we've picked them up through our family of origin, and as well as when we began to display ways that we regulated our emotions, how was that responded to within our family of origin, within our peer groups, within society at large, and basically the things that were more acceptable with our families and our peer groups are the things that became our strategies. The ways that we emotionally regulate. So some of these strategies are healthier than others, and that is because, of course, it depends on, since we are picking up these strategies of emotional regulation from our families of origin, from our peer groups, people we spend time with, depending on how healthy our families and our peers are, we're more likely to mirror what we see. And again, what was acceptable. So sometimes the strategies that we've picked up aren't particularly healthy. And again, there's no blame here. Most of us didn't necessarily have someone who could coach us early on, including, our parents and our grandparents didn't have people to coach us on emotional regulation. So so we were at the mercy of what we had and what was just sort of accepted in our family lines and within our, as I said, our peers and our culture. So our goal today is learning how to become more mindful with emotional regulation, and what we're currently using as regulation and what we might try to move towards so that we can start to employ as healthy of strategies as possible. Now, there are a number of factors that impact our ability to regulate, and this can be how much stress we're experiencing, any kinds of mental health challenges that we might be going through, past traumas, different neurotypes. So for example, somebody with ADHD and a variety of other neurotypes might have more of a challenge with emotional regulation. And part of that is because what's happening is that the brain has a role in processing emotion. And of course, our brains all work differently. So the way that an ADHD brain works, for example, is that you can experience what's called emotional flooding, where the emotion comes in so strongly and so overwhelmingly that it's very difficult for the brain to put on the brakes and regulate the emotional response. So I mention that because different neurotypes are so common. We don't really talk about them very much in our culture, except for, specific ones like perhaps autism, ADHD. But the reality is we're far more neurally diverse than we really understand at this point. So it's important to recognize that our ability to emotionally regulate is happening really on an unconscious level for the most part, and our brain is really playing a role in this. But it doesn't mean that we're powerless to whatever sort of stress situation or emotional or mental health situation or neurotype or any of those things, as much as they are factors, but we can still continue to obviously work to make this process more conscious. So what do you currently use to regulate? As I said, part of this process today is starting to recognize, well, how do I normally regulate? And are these things the healthiest choices that I can be making? So here's a list in front of you, and some of these are particularly healthy. Some of these are less healthy things, but these are all very common things that we might be doing either consciously or unconsciously to regulate our emotions. And regulate, just to be clear again, is really just a formal word for saying manage, navigate the emotions, but bring them into a state of balance. So we might, take some deep breaths. We might have a meditation practice. We might know that we have to do weekly therapy in order to feel nice and stable. Maybe we go out for a walk or a run, it's journal, talk with friends, take a nap, take a time out, read or watch something uplifting. And again, a lot of these are strategies that we're doing unconsciously. We're not going, I feel unregulated right now. I feel dysregulated. I'm going to watch this YouTube video. It's not really something that happens quite that consciously. It's usually just like, scroll. Oh, that makes me feel better. So these are the things that we're usually employing. As I said, of course, we have ways that we emotionally regulate that are less healthy. And it's important that we don't judge these as good or bad necessarily. Healthy and less healthy can sound like a semantic way of saying good or bad, but really it's just what these other habits might end up doing for us is going to have a bigger impact to our physical health, emotional health, relational health, all of those things. So they have adverse impacts and what we might just call bad. I just tend to not teach from that paradigm of good bad, because we can start to bring in a lot of self-judgment once we're looking at certain behavior as bad. And it's really important that more than anything, we're doing what we feel like we have the capacity to do in order to balance our nervous system. So again, some of these things like addictive behaviors, whether they're around food or alcohol, drugs, media, anything else, self-injury, avoidance, withdrawal, aggression, excessive sleep, excessive exercise. Maybe these were the things that were that we witnessed in our family of origin. Maybe these are the things that our peers do in order to feel better after a hard day or something of that sort. So again, we try to witness these as neutrally as possible, because the minute we bring in judgment to it, we tend to move towards denial, and we go, oh, I don't really do that. That's not something I do, because we're judging it. Whereas if we try to neutralize it, we can be a little more honest with ourselves about, yeah, I do really lean into avoidance and withdrawal when I'm feeling overwhelmed. So one of the things that is important is that we've been talking a lot about emotions as neutral messengers, right? That they're not inherently good or bad, they're just communicating something to us. So if this is the case, if emotions are neutral messengers, what causes us to feel so overwhelmed by them, or flooded, or potentially dysregulated by them? And a large part of that has to do with what I'll simply call meaning making, meaning that we are feeling something and we are making a meaning out of it that may or may not necessarily be true about that situation. And that meaning making that we do is usually very rapid and unconscious, and it's established from previous experiences that we've had with that emotion or similar situations. And then we continue to reinforce that over time. So if we can begin to understand that process a little more, again, this is all part of becoming more mindful of what's happening to you when you experience emotions. And in front of you is a graphic that some of you have seen before if you've taken some of our other classes, specifically the ones where I've talked about core beliefs. And up here at the top, a core belief is simply a belief we have about ourselves, other people, or the world around us. And these are very primal beliefs, like feelings we have about our sense of worth, our lovability, our safety. And those core beliefs feed our thoughts. And then we perceive a situation through those thoughts and beliefs. So we're moving our way through the cycle here. And by the time we are having an emotional response, we are no longer neutrally experiencing that emotional response in the same way that we do when we're talking about it here in a workshop. Because what's happening is we are making meaning from it, and we're making meaning from that emotion in relationship to the perceptions, thoughts, and beliefs that we have about the experience in front of us. And what emotional regulation is really about is it's that thing that comes into this part of the cycle between how we feel and how we behave in response to our emotions. And the reason why that's important is because what this cycle does is it moves us from whatever our behavior is what is going to elicit the response from the outside world, meaning our boss, our friend, our partner, our children. And usually that response just reconfirms that belief we have about our worth, our safety, our lovability, whatever it might be. So the key about emotional regulation is being able to become mindful enough that when we start to experience emotions, we have healthy enough strategies to put into place that we insert right about here, and they begin to be unconscious as well, so that we are going into our behaviors with as much, as I said, of a sense of feeling balanced and calm as possible, because then of course that is going to be what impacts the response that we get from the people around us or the situation around us. And that has the ability to begin to shift the beliefs we have about ourselves, other people, and the world around. So obviously, this is kind of a brief overview to explain this, but it's a way to help you understand that, again, the emotions themselves, they are neutral, but this meaning making that we're making about the feelings is what is creating that sense of dysregulation. So Colleen's going to talk a little bit more about dysregulation.
So when we're looking at dysregulation, we want to be able to identify it and acknowledge it. Otherwise, it's really challenging to change it, shift it, all of that stuff. So there are simple somatic ways to notice dysregulation. And we talk about somatic. Somatic means your body's messages to you, basically, to tell you that things are not in balance. They're not in what's called homeostasis, which means the body's balance with itself. So emotions are now running the show, essentially. So when we're looking at dysregulation, we want to be able to identify it, because then that moment between stimulus, like Susan was talking about, right, where we're having a thought, we're having an experience, and then our response to it, we have a little gap there between something occurring, something we observe, something we experience, and our response to it. And if we're dysregulated, our response may not necessarily be the response we want to give if we were in a regulated state. So when things are a surprise, when things bring a wave or a rush of emotion, when it's a very intense, quick situation, a lot of times that moment of stimulus and that moment of response don't have space in between. And so we want to start to take that time to create a moment in between the stimulus and our response to it. And something that Susan and I talk about a lot is the word responsibility literally means your ability to respond to what is happening. So if you can have a stimulus, notice all the feelings coming up, notice your regulation and dysregulation, notice everything you think about it, but be response able to, you're in charge, essentially, not just the emotions or feelings of how you respond, is really powerful when we're talking about our somatic experience and being regulated and dysregulated. So some simple ways to notice dysregulation are to observe any sort of internal or external urgency, vibration, anxiety. So you'll notice that when someone is really angry and they kind of come at you, your body is going to have a response. And maybe your response is to fight back. But if you can really take that moment of stimulus, right, and then your response, if you can take a deep breath, if you can walk away, if you can, whatever it is, you might have a better chance of not getting into a response that you actually don't authentically want to participate in. So this is starting to break up that cycle that Susan is talking about, where you're not just going to default to mirroring whatever is coming at you, or doing behaviors that you have done in the past that are just your default position. You're actually going to take that moment and start to see, oh yeah, I really want to freak out right now, but instead I'm going to go for a walk or whatever it is. So you then start to be a little bit more in charge of your dysregulation just by noticing it. So noticing desires to leave or move, right? So that would be that flight response that we've talked about before, where you really, yeah, I need to get out of here. I don't want to talk to this person. I know I'm going to freak out. And so I'm going to escape the situation. Now, that may be appropriate, actually. But again, you just want to notice the who's running the show in that moment, in that regulation versus dysregulation way. Notice body tension. So you might have the feeling of freezing up. Your shoulders might go up to your ears. You might have that feeling of I couldn't move if I wanted to. So notice your body tension. Notice if you have a feeling of wanting to lunge forward, to attack, a feeling of wanting to lean back, run away, a feeling of being paralyzed like a deer in headlights. All of these things are going to give you information on where you are in your regulation. And the other piece too is behaviors are going to come up in your somatic response. You may have the instinct to yell, scream, do something to release the tension, right? To scream back, whatever it is. So when we're looking at dysregulation too, you want to be able to, children are such a good example. If you see a kid who's had a lot of sugar, hasn't been outside enough, and you're watching them dysregulate. They go from playing easily with their sibling on the floor to all of a sudden running through the house screaming. Those are dysregulated behaviors. And as human beings, we're constantly in a state of going between regulation and dysregulation all the time. So we just want to be able to observe it and notice when our body is sending us those signals so that we can interrupt those patterns with a little bit more of conscious, autonomous choice inside of it. So that the subconscious mind, the feelings, the emotions, that first burst of energy are not necessarily ruling the show. We get to have a little bit more thoughtfulness, a little bit more mindfulness, a little bit more presence with what's going on, like that curiosity that we talk about. So what do we do with that, right? So now you've noticed all the things and you know that you're in this deep stimulus and you're wanting to interrupt the pattern so you just don't freak out at your partner, start screaming, whatever it is. So what do we do with that once we get to that point of noticing the somatic response? One of the things, and it's very simple, and Susan gave a nice list before of regulated ways to handle dysregulation, is taking long, slow, deep breaths. We've talked about this before, that just as your emotions have the ability to change your physiology, make your heartbeat more rapid, speed up your breath, all of that, create some vibration, things like this, you have the ability to slow your breath down, take some deep breaths, long, slow inhales with long, slow exhales will start to regulate the heartbeat, regulate your ability to kind of literally have enough oxygen to make easy, conscious choices so that you're more in charge of what's really happening. So taking long, slow, deep breaths is going to be a good tool. And at first, this all takes practice because obviously it can be weird if someone's yelling at you and you're like, but the other piece is that when you really take ownership of your experience like that, people's heart rates, their nervous systems, they regulate to the most calm person in the room. So you'll notice with animals, with children, if somebody's excited and excitable, especially if it's the alpha of the situation, the parent, or all of a sudden the dog's running around panting, the kids are yelling. If you calm down your nervous system, everybody else will start to relax. So when you have a situation that's dysregulated, right, just as we as people, you can have situations like that. If you start to do some slow, deep breathing, it automatically is going to start to balance everybody else out. So very helpful. Taking a shower or a bath is very powerful. Doing some showering or bathing. If you, again, kids are just such a good example. If you have a child who's freaking out and you put them in the bathtub, it can take a minute, 15 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes, sometimes, we don't know. The water will calm them down. Well, we are the same way. So if you're feeling particularly anxious, particularly angry, on edge, a bath or a shower, it just changes what happens. And think about it in terms of when you're really sick and you haven't been able to get out of bed or do anything like that for a couple of days, and then you take that bath or a shower, how much better you feel on the back end of that. Just, it literally starts to wash things away. So that really helps with regulation. Isolating for a period of time to regulate can be very helpful. So if you find yourself in a chaotic situation and you don't feel like you have the bandwidth to be able to give a regulated response to whatever is unfolding, you're about to just blow up at the family. Isolating yourself for a period of time, meaning take yourself for a walk, go sit in your car, whatever it is you need to do, will oftentimes give us the moment that we need to be able to regulate ourselves enough to be able to approach the situation with a more measured, more conscious interpretation. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we won't freak out later. It just means that you have a little bit more autonomy in that responding. And then taking accountability for needing to regulate. So another piece with that is just owning, hey, I've had a very long day and this is a lot. And, I noticed that you're upset, or it seems to me that you're upset, and I need to go have a minute. I'm going to take a shower and I will be back. A lot of times situations can escalate really quickly when we can sense that something's coming and both people decide to engage in battle or behaviors that are not necessarily super nourishing, super productive, things like that. And you'll notice too, if you're feeling dysregulated or someone else in your life is, they might want to engage in battle. You might want to fight. And so it's all the more important to realize, like, is that the most productive thing to do? Sometimes it is. Obviously, fighting is part of the human experience. Sometimes engaging in things that are really challenging can be good. I still recommend doing it from a regulated place, because if you're doing it from a dysregulated place, it can end up being emotionally violent, psychically violent, psychologically violent, all of that. So you want to make sure that when you are engaging in relationship, that your being is as stable and as regulated as you possibly can be to be able to be really responsible in that situation. That's what being adults is all about in a real standard. So with that, I will pass it to Susan.
All right, so moving into anger today. There are a lot of different ways that we can define anger, but I liked this definition from the American Psychological Association as just a sort of working definition for us for today, which is anger is an emotion characterized by antagonism towards someone or something that you feel has deliberately done you wrong. So as I said, of course, that's not always what anger is founded in, but it's a good foundational definition. So we've talked about the fact that emotions are messengers, right? They're just communicating something to us. So what is anger communicating? Because a lot of times, of course, we have all kinds of judgments about anger within ourselves and other people. Anger is often a very misunderstood emotion, but anger communicates a crossed boundary, perhaps an unmet need, underlying feelings. So oftentimes there is something else underneath, feelings of shame, as we've talked about, grief, fear, any kind of powerlessness or hopelessness, sense of hurt or betrayal. So there's a number of different things that might be under the surface for anger. And that is one of the things that it might be trying to communicate to you. A real or perceived threat. So again, anger goes along with our fight response. So recently, one of my friends was talking about like, in these situations, I feel like so much anger come up. And I helped them actually recognize that what was happening is that some of these situations were triggering a stress response or a trauma response. And their default trauma response was fight, as in fight, flight, freeze, etc. And so what's happening is oftentimes we either feel a threat or we perceive a threat, whether or not there really is one, and we move into that fight response almost unconsciously for most of us. And it reads as anger, of course, because fight and anger kind of go together. So that's sometimes what it is communicating. Oftentimes it's unprocessed trauma. We have something that is underneath the surface, again, that usually left us with unresolved feelings of shame, betrayal, powerlessness, those kinds of things. So there is a source oftentimes for those underlying feelings. And that is one of the big things that anger is communicating. So some other common anger triggers are if you feel frustrated about being unable to communicate a boundary or a need. So oftentimes, we have a boundary, we have a need, but either we're not super conscious of what it is, or we're conscious of it and we can't find a way to communicate it. Either we can't find the words, or we feel like the other person isn't able to hear or receive what we're trying to say. And so the anger is coming up, or the frustration is coming up in response to that. As I said, with the real or perceived threat, it might be, someone is literally like trying to hurt you, or somebody you love, or maybe it's an injustice in society. A lot of times, we're witnessing or experiencing some kind of injustice. On a smaller level, we might witness somebody breaking the law, or even a cultural kind of thing, like somebody's cutting in line and we feel really angry about it. But all of those things are really, again, like a kind of crossed boundary, so to speak. So I think most of our anger triggers can really be distilled down to one of these 5 things. So our relationship to anger, like any other emotions, often rooted in how we saw it expressed. Like if we were permitted to express anger in our household, or if it was the default emotional expression, meaning maybe it was the only thing we were allowed to express. Was it managed well? Was it not managed well? And one of the big things that can happen with anger is that we conflate anger with aggression. Now, they're actually 2 different things. So anger is the neutral emotion that communicates something to us, like I was just referring to, and aggression is that harmful expression of anger. And what happens when we confuse the 2 is that we end up disallowing our anger. So we push it down, we suppress it because we perceive it as negative, because we're associating it with aggression, which we judge as harmful, which it generally is. But when we do that, when we disallow that anger, when we suppress it, what ends up happening is the anger doesn't just magically go away. That would be nice if it did, but it doesn't. It just gets processed differently. So oftentimes in ways that create internal damage for us. So we might have mental or physical health issues as a result of suppressing that anger. So the key really is to better understand the deeper reasons behind that anger. So consciously taking that time, like we've been talking about, of investigating what that particular emotional messenger of anger is communicating to you, because by doing that, it's going to inform some kind of action for you. Oftentimes anger, and this is what we can consider kind of the gift of anger, is it is actually trying to move us towards action. It's trying to move us toward an action in our personal life or maybe in society. So it's not inherently bad. So there's a few different ways that anger can manifest. So depending on who you are, you might think, oh, I'm not that angry of a person. But remember, just like all of these emotions we're talking about, they all are emotions that we experience. So you might have a certain version of anger. We've got our unexpressed or passive anger. And these are people that usually become distant, quiet. Maybe they repress or suppress anger, or really any feelings of anger, to the point where they don't even recognize it as anger anymore. So we hear like, oh, I'm not angry, but it's, as I said, it's not very human to not have anger. So typically it's in there somewhere. And this unexpressed or passive anger can oftentimes lead to resentment. Sometimes it could lead to self-harm because the anger doesn't have an outlet, but then there's this feeling we have that we don't know what to do with. So we target it onto ourselves. It can have, as I mentioned, a lot of health issues. So unexpressed or passive anger oftentimes has a very internalized impact. And then we have our explosive or aggressive anger. And this manifests as blaming, defensive behaviors, maybe the shouting, the swearing, name calling, threatening. It might be physical, like you lash out physically. Maybe you're hitting people or objects or animals or something of that sort. So this is the explosive or aggressive anger. And of course, this can lead to a lot of fear from other people, maybe even yourself. You might be afraid of yourself. Like many people are afraid when they get angry, which is why they suppress it, is because they feel like their anger gets very explosive. It also can lead to diminished trust within your relationships. So Colleen will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But so this explosive or aggressive anger tends to have more of an externalized impact. As I mentioned, the passive is more internalized. So then we have sideways or passive aggressive anger. So this is where we get the silent treatment, maybe sideways comments, maybe some retaliatory behaviors without really ever addressing what was bothering us or the other person. So this one really can lead to both internalized and externalized impact. We might experience a lot of resentment in this scenario, but we're also going to maybe experience a lot of diminished trust depending on how we're managing the anger in this case.
So let's talk about anger's effect on our relationships. When we have a lot of anger and we don't know what to do with it, we're not acknowledging it, and it starts to kind of rule the show, but in a way that is unacknowledged. It can come out, like Susan was talking about, in all of these complex and sideways ways. And we want to address it because unlike fear, shame, grief, anger has a way of affecting our relationships in a more direct, profound way. Because when anger is not handled by us, it essentially starts to spill out in other ways. So one of the ways, like Susan was talking about, is sideways anger, where there's little aggressive comments or behaviors, actions that start to affect the people around us, our work situations, things like that. Likewise, you might be on the receiving end of that kind of a thing. So anger, when it's not managed or dealt with in a clear, direct way, meaning acknowledging that you're feeling angry, being able to handle it, handle what's underneath it, things like that, it will come out in these other ways. And a lot of times resentment over time, which is that suppressed anger, like Susan was talking about, will come out in very sideways ways, unconscious ways, ways where you'll do things to make other people angry, even though you're not aware of it. So you will lock them out, you will accidentally hang up on them, you'll do other things that will be these kind of like little subtle ways where the anger and the resentment is coming out. Likewise, obviously, overt attacking can happen with a lot of anger that's been stored up, or anger that's just running through. So, and a lot of times with overt attacking, there will be a feeling of needing to defend your position, needing to make sure that you're taken care of. So it's that very fight response coming up from a trauma response way, that something is being, some sort of barrier is being breached, and I need to protect, guard. So of overt attacking is very harmful in relationships, obviously, because a lot of times it's not matching the situation. So if there's a feeling of, needing to lash out, things like that, you want to make sure that you're managing that yourself if you have that propensity, and you want to make sure that you are addressing that really directly and clearly, and ideally calmly, when somebody else has a lot of anger going on. And a lot of times it's just calling it out, and that can make anger more loud for a minute. But even just acknowledging, like, I'm feeling a lot of anger right now, or it seems like there's a lot of anger happening right now. You want to call it out, because then it starts to lose its power a little bit. Just like, okay, it's something that's overlaying this misunderstanding, this disagreement, this boundary crossing, and we can manage it. So feeling better after blowing up but not repairing the damage is a common thing with anger when it's not managed. So when anger is not directly taken care of, what can happen is that it will overtake people and situations. And when that person has let go of their anger, i.e., they have had some sort of blow up experience, everybody else feels terrible and kind of is walking on eggshells. They might feel better and might not even remember exactly what they said, how aggressive they were. They might not remember throwing a vase, things like that. So when you are in a situation where you or someone else is having that, you want to be very aware. If you feel like you've been overtly attacked in that way, when the waters are calm again, reapproach that situation. So when your partner has calmed down, you can reapproach that situation and be like, hey, just so you know, for me and the kids, it's very scary when you throw a vase and yell. Because a lot of times what happens is when the nervous system gets calm again, there's literally kind of an amnesia that happens in the brain where they won't remember everything they said, everything they did. And so it's not about keeping score, but there is a way that it's important to really circle back around to set up clear boundaries around how anger can be managed in your relationship, in your family, in your home. Likewise, you want to be responsive to that in yourself, be able to really notice when you are losing it or you have lost it, and circle back around and apologize and really try to mend that behavior, because otherwise it can get very unmanaged. Blame and shame are other ways that anger can come out in these sideways ways of really blaming other people for situations, shaming them for situations, you know, well, I would have done that thing, but you weren't here on time. Things like that. Like, so these are ways that anger can work its way in. And we want to make sure that we are really acknowledging that we're angry and try to manage those things in a much clearer way, because otherwise it starts to spill out really quickly into these, it's like a fire essentially, and we'll start to take over what's happening. So anger, a little bit differently than the other emotions, it can directly harm and affect relationship situations really quickly. So you want to make sure it's not about not having anger, because we all have moments at least in life, or maybe we have a lot of anger in our lives. We came from families that have a lot of anger, things like that. Like Susan was saying, it's very natural. It's a go-to for us. But the bottom line is it can be, when it isn't managed, it's not taken care of, it's not addressed, it can be really harmful in relationships. So you want to make sure that you're taking care with that and really cleaning it up as it happens. If not, stopping it on that front end, like we were talking about with stimulus and response. So with that, I will pass it to Susan.
All right, so we did get a question about what is a good way to deal with someone who's external and in denial. And I feel like as Colleen went on there, she actually did address some of that. So, so part of it is that denial is that selective amnesia as well. So the person who is in denial is oftentimes, it's literally because they are unable to track the behavior, especially, of course, this gets complex if there are additional factors like substance use or something that might impair the memory of the situation or anything of that sort. So feel free to, as we move into the reflection questions, add some more specific questions around that if you feel like you would like a little more guidance about that, or as I said, perhaps Colleen already addressed that with the rest of her answer. So these again are just some things for you to reflect on here in this moment, or you can certainly take them with you in your reflections for the week. But which emotions are hardest for me to tolerate? So this might be within yourself or within somebody else, or both. And then, of course, which emotions are easiest for me to tolerate? So you can think in terms of the 4 that we're focusing on in this training. Otherwise, of course, just in a broader sense. What behaviors do I tend to use to manage my feelings? So again, this goes back to that list that we were talking about. I'm just going to scroll back to it myself so I can throw some of them out to you in case it's helpful. But these are the things that I was talking about that include anything from the, breathing, meditating, journaling, talking to friends, taking a time out, taking a nap. It might be, as I said, some kind of addictive behavior. It might be It might be alcohol or drug use, it might be food, it might be media, it might be shopping, it could be any number of things that you know that you partake in. Avoidance, withdrawal. So what are the behaviors that you tend to use to manage your feelings? And remembering the goal of reflecting on these and answering the questions is that we want to be really mindful that we're not judging any of these behaviors. We're attempting to be a neutral observer and just see what things that we lean into. Sometimes when we become aware of these behaviors, the behaviors themselves and seeing that we're doing them is the indication that we are dysregulated. So for example, it's not necessarily that you're conscious of the dysregulation and then you do the thing. You recognize you're doing the thing and you go, okay, what's going on? Like I noticed, the example I always give is if I'm on Pinterest a little too long, I'll be like, okay, what's actually going on here? Because I can feel that I'm being a little avoidant, don't want to just like set my phone down or set my laptop down, because what will happen if I do that is feelings will come up and maybe they're feelings I don't really want to deal with in that moment. And so I'll recognize those behaviors. Of these 4 emotions, the emotions that we're working with in this month together, which is of course, again, fear, shame, anger, and grief. Which emotion do you feel people use the most to manipulate or control situations? Yeah, feel free to answer in the group here too. Yeah, fear. The interesting thing, of course, is that it's probably going to be a different answer for all of you, because of course, many times people will use any of these feelings to manipulate or control a situation. And what I find is interesting is if you start to see that a lot of people in your life are using fear or using anger to control a situation or manipulate a situation, it would be good for you to reflect on what your relationship is to that feeling. Because it may not even be that people are using that feeling more than other feelings. It might just be the one you notice because of your own relationship to that feeling. Maybe it's a feeling that makes you really uncomfortable. So yeah. Exactly. So fear, anger mostly, and at a religious school I attended as a kid, it felt more shame-based. So again, it's like recognizing that a lot of times, depending on the situation, that different emotions will be used to impact us. I think we're seeing this a lot now in our collective as well, of course, with all the different feelings, very, very big feelings that people have about pretty much everything right now. So of course we see this on both the interpersonal level, and we see it in the media, we see it on a number of different levels. All right. So we're going to open this up to questions as usual now. We have a little bit of time here for some questions in coaching. So again, if we want to go back to that that question, good way to deal with someone who's external and in denial. Feel free to elaborate on that, or if anybody else, excuse me, has any questions about anything specific that we've talked about or that we haven't talked about. And it doesn't have to be this week's content either. You know, if you have something that, you know, came up in your reflection last week on emotional triggers or noticing anything, feel free. I'll just give you a minute here to type it up in the questions, and I'll just tell you a quick thing while you're hopefully sending questions our way. Emotional regulation, it can be very personal to you, meaning, you know, we talked about a lot of techniques here that are more what I would call universal techniques that, you know, the average person might decide to use. But I know, like for myself, that there are some things that I've learned to do that I know are helpful for me in certain situations. Even just a couple of days ago, I was in a scenario in public where I felt very overwhelmed and hot and kind of anxious, and there was a lot of kind of anxiety in the environment, and I started to feel a little like lightheaded, a little woozy. And in the past, those are scenarios where I would either feel like I was about to pass out or actually pass out. And so I've learned that if I start to feel that somatic response that Colleen is talking about, I will just like crouch down, get close to the ground, take a couple deep breaths. And I used to feel like kind of embarrassed by that. And now I just don't anymore, because I just go, okay, it's just what I need to do to, like, it would probably be worse if I passed out right now. So I'm just gonna like crouch down and take a few deep breaths. And honestly, most people don't even notice because they're doing their own thing, you know? So I offer that to say that you got to figure out for you what your somatic things are that are showing you that there's some, you know, some kind of overwhelm, and then what's your technique going to be. Okay, so I'm going to read some of your things here. Yeah, so somebody is asking about that. One of their triggers is the news itself, but they do want to keep up on the news or feel like they should anyway. But how do you manage all of that? The environmental things, fires, COVID, all of those things. Colleen, you want to field that?
Yeah, some of it is knowing at what point in the day is that a good time for you to take that information in. So part of it is not just feeling like in the search for wanting to be an informed and educated person, that you decide that the first thing I'm going to do in the morning is, you know, start reading the terribly devastating news of the day, because that will make it so that I'm more connected and more informed in the world. That might be the exact right time of day for you. But for a lot of people, it's better actually to kind of get your emotional rhythms established for the day. And then when you have space later on in the day, it's good. Likewise, at the end of the day, usually is not a great time for people to, right before you go to sleep or you're going into kind of that rest time, to be taking in a lot of information. So find times in the day where that works for you. And also notice when it's too much, when you're overwhelmed, when it's enough, when you've read enough stories of tragedy and sadness or whatever it is, to be able to be like, okay, that's enough for today. And also, I would say match the positive input of media experiences to whatever you perceive to be the negative experience of media influences. So if that's finding kittens on Pinterest or whatever that is for you, like making sure that there's an equal amount of things that are bringing you some sort of like, oh, I love this little video or whatever, because it leaves a more emotionally regulated place for you. And it doesn't mean that all of these other things are not happening. It just means that kittens are also still cute. So you're giving yourself the ability to see a more holistic picture of what's ongoing in the world. And it's way easier to digest then. Hopefully that helps.
So thank you for that, Colleen. That's great too. Balance is key, right? So I've been in a situation where I tried to walk away, someone was denying anger issues, but it was physical. So I think one of the things that's really important to recognize is that safety is always going to be your, primary concern in situations where somebody is expressing anger like that. You're not going to be able to reason with somebody in that kind of situation. So obviously it's not about trying to regulate inside of that situation. It is about getting yourself hopefully as quickly as possible to a safe environment, and then recognizing that you're probably going to feel pretty dysregulated after that situation. And then how do you return to balance as much as you can after that situation? And then is this somebody that you have future contact with? All of that. This is where there's some complexities in what Colleen was talking about with people who are not willing to acknowledge or repair harm that they've created. So obviously that's a pretty complex question, and there wouldn't be a one quick answer for it, but in the context of what we're talking about today, it's doing your best to create safety for you first and foremost, and then attempt regulation as quickly as possible so you don't stay in that stress state for longer than than is ideal, which of course we do what we can, right? Sometimes we have a limited ability to regulate after these extreme stressors. So unprocessed trauma, grief was mentioned. What do you advise for how best to process something if it's been years since it took place? Revisit it and then do some positive behaviors. I'm good at identifying feelings, but then it seems to linger longer than I want. Yeah, I think you actually gave a really good way of approaching it. Part of what happens when we are what we could call reprocessing something from the past is we want to make sure that we are doing that in a safe container, meaning that we're not talking about trauma with somebody who we don't necessarily feel established trust with, and you might not even feel that with a therapist, meaning that sometimes therapists will try to dive into your unprocessed trauma before you trust them, and that's not ideal. Oftentimes also trauma isn't really great to be processed verbally in talk therapy. Colleen and I are both breathwork practitioners. We help people process trauma somatically through the body because it bypasses a lot of the story of the mind, and sometimes just the retelling of the story can be triggering. And so if you do find yourself in a scenario where some kind of unprocessed trauma or grief is coming up, either because you were processing it with a trusted individual or professional, or just on your own, then yes, basically what's happening is it's unprocessed because chances are you didn't have the opportunity to regulate or get the support you needed or whatever it might have been at the time of the trauma. So we were just talking about that situation where there's maybe physical violence or something expressed to you, and maybe you didn't get away from it, or maybe you were able to get away from it, but you didn't process it fully, and so that trauma still lives in the body. So when you start to think about that again, basically, yes, it is an invitation for you to try to find a healthy strategy in this moment, because a memory, our body experiences it somatically on a body, based level, brain-based level, a memory, just like if it was happening to us in the here and now. So that does mean that, of course, if we can regulate in the here and now, we can, begin to rewire the brain a little bit in terms of that. So yeah, it can linger longer than we would like, unfortunately, but it will linger less long if you can employ some of the regulation strategies when you're feeling those moments of trigger. All right.
I wanted to add in, I know we're at time here, but I just want to say, circling back to the physical situation where you're feeling like you're in harm's way, if it's not a one-off situation, meaning where you're at a bar and it's a random stranger or something like that, but it's an ongoing relationship, you really want to consider, if the person is in serious denial, has a lot of rage issues like that, it's good to bring in a third party to revisit those conversations. Meaning like some sort of professional, a therapist, something like that, because you will feel safer then, and they're more likely to regulate in front of someone else. So there's a way that just works for human beings. They're less likely to have that kind of level of rage or things like that. And so it's just good to have that in your field of consciousness, that if it's actually like something that you're afraid of, and it's a relationship that you can't cut off, that you want to be able to have the possibility of having another party come in to have those more challenging conversations.
All right, thank you, everyone. I see some of you are needing to bow out, so thank you so much for joining us. We'll pop some fun homework in the Mighty Networks group, but just if you're still on the line here, it's to watch the film Inside Out. It's a Pixar film, and it's all about emotions, and it's actually very accurate in a lot of ways. So it's just a little fun thing if you have the opportunity to do that sometime this week or this weekend. And all right, we will see you all in either Mighty Networks or here next week. Take care.